This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Good evening. Welcome to this week's edition of African Drums, a television organ of the Cuffy 250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the Afro-Guyanese community through education and the encouragement of self-activity. I am Elsie and I will be the host for today's program. Guyana is known as the Co-operative Republic of Guyana. But do we really understand or know the significance of the word cooperative in that name? The idea and practice of cooperatives are as old as human society. They arose out of the human instinct for survival. The institution and organization of the tribe, for example, are premised on the idea of cooperatives, the pooling of resources for the common benefit of the collective. In this regard, cooperatives predate what we refer to as the modern Caribbean. The Amerindian and African tribal systems from which parts of our Caribbean family emerged were essentially cooperative systems. Here in Guyana, cooperatives have had particular resonance. From the time of the village movement in the immediate post-emancipation era to the present, cooperatives have been part of the Guyanese socio-economic landscape. The fact that the term cooperative has found itself inserted in the very description of our country is testimony to this assertion. It is, therefore, a national phenomenon. But, as with most of our national institutions, cooperatives have had particular origins. The pioneers of the village movement set the ball rolling by pooling their individual resources to acquire the lands, which they then translated into cooperative or collective spaces. The idea of the cooperative as an organizing principle has been since very central to the African Guyanese community. One may argue then, with some justification, that cooperatives, as practice and institution, have been one of the many contributions of Africans to modern Guyana. Recently, cooperatives have been very much in the news because they have become embroiled in a struggle for their very survival. This is not a new problem, but coming at a time when African Guyanese communities are generally challenged, it has larger significance. In keeping with its mission of educating Guyana about the African experience in our country, the Cuffy 250 Committee recently held a forum on the state of cooperatives. One of the things that we learned is that there is a need for more knowledge about the history and practice of cooperatives. These and other relevant questions will be explored on today's edition of African Drums as we continue our journey into the African Guyanese experience in Guyana. To help us answer these questions are two distinguished guests who are both experts on cooperatives. Mr. Vincent Alexander is the Registrar at the University of Guyana and a longtime social and political activist. Mr. Rawle is currently a columnist at the Stabroek News, where he does the weekly business page and could be described as a practicing cooperativist. Gentlemen, welcome to African Drums.
Thank you very much.
Let me get straight to the heart of the matter. Why is it important for us to be discussing cooperatives in May 2014 in Guyana?
Well, I would say it's extremely important given that the fate of 200 cooperatives is hanging in the balance at this time. And so there's a need for the public at large to have an understanding of what is it we're dealing with when we talk about the fate of 200 cooperatives, which may affect one sector of our society more than the other sectors. But the fact that Guyana itself had bequeathed to it the name Cooperative Republic, it suggests that there should be at least a historical consciousness as to why a country would call unto itself such a name. So I think it's an issue that is rather current, but it's also an issue that has a lot to do with the evolution of the Guyanese society.
Okay, Mr. Lucas?
Yeah, I would say that there's also a practical side, to the issue. Guyana is still largely an agricultural economy, and one of the things that we have discovered is in several parts of the world, particularly in some of the more industrialized countries, the cooperative has been found to be a very integral part of the production structure of those countries, particularly where agriculture is concerned. And we in Guyana are attempting to ensure that we have a very strong agricultural sector and to guarantee our own food security. So I think from a very practical point of view, we also need to be talking about the cooperative as a means by which we can strengthen our economy and expand the opportunities which exist within the economy.
Okay. As was said in the opening statements, cooperatives can be linked back to the post-emancipation movement in Guyana. Mr. Alexander, can you expand on the history of cooperatives for us and put it into the context of Guyanese society?
Well, first of all, I would wish to say that cooperatives are not peculiar to Guyana. And in fact, one can look at it from two perspectives. One can see cooperatives as an institution, but rather than that is the philosophy of collectivism or cooperativism, which you referred to earlier, cooperativism being adopted in Guyana to drive the development of the country. And so from an institutional perspective, one can go back to the emergence of cooperatives in Europe. At a particular point in time, really as a recognized institution and a popular institution, cooperatives emerged just about the time of the Industrial Revolution. And this happened at a time when there was a lot of displacement of labor because of mechanization. And so a lot of the artisans and craftsmen and so on were being displaced by virtue of industrialization, sought to find a mechanism by which they could re-enter the market, by which they could find meaningful employment, competitive enterprise, and they saw the cooperative as a way to do that. So what's important to note here is that historically, the cooperative is identified with collectivism, where individuals did not have the opportunity or the means on their own to compete with big enterprises, and found coming together as a mechanism for providing employment and being sufficiently competitive with big enterprises. In fact, cooperatives themselves became big enterprises. So I think we need to underline that. We need to see that cooperatives have always been associated with the working people, the peasantry, attempting to use their numbers as a means of viability in the economic sphere. Now, in the course of this, they developed a number of principles because cooperatives did not mirror the private enterprise organization. They tend to have their own structure and their own principles, and so they develop a number of principles, and I'd like to enunciate on those principles a bit. In fact, from an institutional perspective, reference is made to the Rochdale principles which were first enunciated in 1937 by the International Cooperative Association and revised down to 1995 in the present form of one, a voluntary and open membership. So the first thing about cooperatives is does not exclude. It's voluntary and open to all. There should be no discrimination in terms of the membership. Secondly, democratic member control. And here's an important element of the cooperative in the sense that the idea was not that capital would determine the weight of one's involvement, that one man, one vote system was allowed, so democratic control. And here's where you see some difference from what pertains in the corporate world, corporate as opposed to cooperative world.
Yes.
In private enterprise, where it's the amount of shares you have that makes the difference. And then members' participation in economic activity. As I said, the cooperatives emerged at a time when people were displaced, and they were looking for means by which they could have economic activity. So it's not a matter of investment, or it's not merely a matter of investment. It's a matter of finding a way to be involved in the economic activity as a participant, as a producer, or as a service provider. So that is emphasized as well when you talk about cooperatives. It's not merely somebody putting money and buying shares. It's the people who are in the cooperative themselves, providing employment and providing services to the public. And then there is the principle of autonomy and independence. In other words, cooperatives are not aligned necessarily to any political party or to any government of the day. It's an entity pursuing a particular objective, non-aligned to a particular party or entity, or subordinate to any other group. Given the nature of cooperatives, another of the principles is the question of education, training, and information. Because obviously one will have to educate that membership or train them and provide them with information so that in fact they could be engaged in what is required of them as cooperators. And then to make the movement, to make the cooperative something powerful, we normally talk about unity and strength, and so cooperatives as a principle also sought to have cooperation among the cooperatives so that they could impact, so they could have a voice. You know, if you look at the private sector, they have a private sector commission where they work together, and it's the same will apply to the cooperatives where they sought to work together so they can have one voice when speaking to other stakeholders. And finally, the final principle, and one that we should really take note of, concern for community. The cooperative is not alien to the community, it is of the community, it is for the community, and so you find that cooperatives in some instances were not necessarily economic entities, but they were entities that sought to be involved in the community in areas of activity like self-help and things of that nature. Now, having enunciated those principles, we come to see that in Guyana, after the emancipation of the ex-slaves, that they almost naturally gravitated towards this form of enterprise for the reasons that I enunciated earlier. They were individuals. They did not have, as individuals, the means to be competitive. They wanted to create opportunities and employment for themselves. They didn't want to continue to be working for menial wages on estates. And so what they did, they came together.
Pooled their resources.
They pooled their resources in entities where they were going to be the participant workers of the entities, the participant service providers. They adopted the principle of the democratic control, where it was one person, one vote. Of course, they were to establish a management committee. So we saw this whole idea of cooperativism in the village movement emerging after the emancipation. And I think you made an important point. If one looks even before emancipation, one would see the very nature of Amerindian activity was also cooperative. to a very large extent. And we also saw a significant level of cooperative interaction among the indentured laborers as well, the Indo-Guyanese. When they came, it was less formal, but they too, in fact, one would see that each group that came to Guyana, for the purpose of its well-being and its survival, engaged in some kind of cooperative activity.
Yes.
And we saw that at one time you had a Chinese association which would have facilitated the interaction among the Chinese as they cooperated to survive in a hostile environment, the Indian Association, and so all of the groups in some way embraced this whole idea of the cooperatives. And so Guyana, in looking for a path for its growth and its development, and wanted to create a society that was a just society, a society that gave equal opportunity to all, recognized that one could not leave it merely to private enterprise if one wanted to do that, and that the cooperative could work in that stead. And therefore, given the historical nature of our communities and that they had embraced cooperatives, sought to make cooperativism the national philosophy that will drive relationships among individuals, not only among individuals, but among organizations, so that one could say that in terms of cooperativism, the idea of a trisectoral economy with the cooperative sector is one sector, the private enterprise is another sector, and the state, but with some level of interaction and cooperation for the wholeness of the economy, also represented the spirit of cooperativism. The whole question of village management, the emergence of self-help activities towards self-sufficiency, all embraced, so that a lot of what Guyana has gone through over the years, unto today, is reflective of a cooperative spirit. And there are significant cooperatives that have survived. I think that one can easily point to the fishing sector as one sector where you still have a significant presence of cooperatives. It does not interfere with individual endeavor, but it allows individuals, though they may have individual ownership, to pool at a cooperative level for acquisition of things, for distribution of things. So cooperatives is a very adaptable mechanism for people's involvement for their well-being and development.
Yes, and a little further in the discussion, we'll get into the actual benefits for individuals and other groups. But now that we've understood the history of cooperatives in general and in Guyana, I think it's interesting to note that whenever you ask a person what is a cooperative, they have a fair idea of what it is. But if you ask them how exactly is it organized, they're not able to tell you. Mr. Lucas, as a member of a cooperative, can you tell us exactly how cooperatives are organized?
Yeah, what I would, just before I answer that question, what I would like to say in addition to what Vincent just said, was that the cooperative, there was a study done by the ILO in 2009 after the global economic crisis of 2008, and what that study produced was evidence, strong evidence, that cooperatives tend to be formed as a result of crises, and they found that cooperatives have tended to be the best response to a crisis. And we have seen, for example, in a place like the United States of America, cooperatives actually being used as well to fulfill unmet needs. And as Vincent pointed out, there tends to be a focus on community. And in the context of the United States of America, what you have found is many utilities, things like water supply, electricity in particular, and even telecommunications, all of those things which appeared uneconomical for a private enterprise to engage in were all pursued through the cooperative effort. So what you have found, therefore, is in the United States of America, for example, you would find that 50% of the electricity transmission and distribution is done through the cooperative, a cooperative enterprise. In fact, in a report which was put out by the International Cooperative Alliance, which is a global body that advocates on behalf of cooperatives around the world, they indicated that about 75% of the land mass of the United States of America is powered by cooperative societies, not private individuals. And during that economic period, that economic crisis that I just referred to, what you found was that many private electric companies that were going under were actually rescued by co-op societies. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, yes, it does two things. One, it helps you to respond to a crisis. And two, in situations where you have unmet needs,
Yes.
it actually enables you, to find ways of actually providing a necessary service. So in the context of how co-ops, therefore, which are so important, are organized, in the context of Guyana, there is a process, and the process starts with at least 7 persons who have an interest writing a letter to the Chief Cooperative Development Officer indicating a desire to form a cooperative society. What then happens is the chief would perhaps identify someone with the relevant expertise in cooperatives to meet with the members of that prospective group and try to ascertain the level of interest, the degree of commitment, and perhaps even gain some kind of assessment as to whether or not the efforts that they plan to pursue would be viable. Once they're satisfied, they will perhaps have 3 or 4 meetings with the members, helping them to fully understand what it is that they're trying to do and helping them to craft the documents that would be required, particularly the bylaws and so forth, to become a registered society. Once they have completed their registry, their documentation, that is then submitted to the Co-ops department. The Co-ops department processes it and makes a determination as to whether to register that society or not. So the process is a very simple one, and I think the more people understand what is involved, I think it will become easier for those who are interested in forming cooperative societies to do so.
Okay, and can you tell us if this information that you've just given us is available formally in any place in Guyana? So, for example, if I wanted to start a cooperative with 6 other colleagues, is there some place that I can go and just get this information, or I would have to, say, Google it, check it out on the internet?
No, as I said, I think part of the reason for the existence of the Co-op department is to provide some kind of assistance and a guidance to persons who are interested. So once that letter is written, it triggers the process.
Okay.
Whether there is actual documented information about the process, I cannot say. I am not aware of any such documentation, but perhaps the Co-ops department might have that, and an inquiry of them probably should help us to understand that.
If
Okay.
I could add to that,
Sure.
as a part of the structure of the cooperative movement in Guyana, there is a Guyana National Cooperative Union,
Okay.
which is a kind of umbrella body for cooperatives, and I think that one could go to them if one wants information on cooperatives and on the formation of cooperatives. I think the extent to which credit unions are also cooperatives, though they are better known as credit unions, and the Credit Union League,
Yeah.
which also exists as an umbrella body, is another place to which one could turn for information on cooperatives. Previously, we had the Kuru Cooperative College, which was designated for cooperative education. I think that the college, at least the residential college in Kuru has been transformed into something else. It's no longer dedicated to cooperatives. But the Durban backland, they continue to have cooperative college, so-called, and one may be able to get some information there. But having said that, one should not ignore the fact that the ministry is responsible for assisting cooperatives as well.
Yes.
So they should, and this is the Ministry of Social Security in this instance, Ministry of Labor and Social Security.
Yeah.
But there is a act, Cooperative Act, part of the laws of Guyana, that guides this whole process. And one could access that law, and from that one can also glean what is required. And that law could be found online at this time on the website of the Ministry of Legal Affairs. So a citizen who has access to a computer can go to that website, look for the Cooperative Act, and get in his bedroom, so to speak, information on cooperatives.
Okay. Well, viewers, some of you might just be joining us. I am Elsie Harry, and this is African Drums, a feature of the Cuffy 250 Committee. And on this evening's program, we have been discussing the history and significance of cooperatives in general, and of course, in the Afro-Guyanese communities. So, and our two in-studio guests are Mr. Vincent Alexander and Mr. Lucas. And what I would like to hear from Mr. Alexander now is, how do people benefit personally from cooperatives?
Well, cooperatives could be seen as socio-economic units.
Yes.
Socio-economic units. And the idea behind the cooperative is to provide economic opportunities. In some regards, it is a form of self-employment,
Yes.
because you are both the employer
And the employee. Yes.
You're the one who formed the cooperative, and so you're responsible for the existence of the entity. But the principles would lead you in a direction where, having formed it, then you yourself would be engaged in the activity. So it is, the benefit there is one that can provide employment. Now, it provides opportunities that individuals might not otherwise be able to have because of the pooling of resources.
Yes.
So that's an advantage of the cooperative and a benefit to individuals, that where you don't have the wherewithal yourself to be engaged in a particular kind of enterprise, that you can join with others. So it provides an opportunity to be involved in the enterprise which you could not otherwise be involved in. Now, cooperatives are community-oriented, and so we have the history, for example, of particularly in the housing industry, where historically people would come together in the community and collectively build each other's home. And you can have lots of rural people can tell you that they build their own home without paying any carpenters, by simply a cooperative effort, where individuals came together on the Sunday, Saturday, and they cooked a pot of food and whatever other they had, and they worked together. Now that became a national movement.
Yes.
And so if one looks at places like Melanie Damanshana, one would see that those places were built by cooperative effort, where essentially the potential householders came together into units and built those houses one after the other, so that they avoided the cost of labor for construction because of the cooperative effort in which they were engaged. I can go further to tell my own experience as a student of Christ Church in the early 70s. If you look at Christ Church now, it is thrice the size that it was at the inception of the 70s. And the 2/3 which has been added was built by the cooperative effort of the students of that school. They bought a professional contractor, but he guided the students. We made the blocks, we did the construction, and at that time, that kind of cooperative effort was supported by the Department of Cooperatives, and they would provide us with hampers based on the number of hours that we worked. So we would take home hampers of essentials, milk and sugar and things like that. And what happened there as another benefit is that we were able to acquire skills.
Yes.
So by virtue of being involved in the building enterprise, we were able to walk away from skills, and we were school children.
Yes.
And certainly we could then use those skills when you get to building cooperative houses
Yes.
at some other stage in the process. So the cooperative really provides an opportunity, an economic opportunity for people to benefit from an economic venture, to be employed, to acquire skills, and to be able to contribute to community development.
And that would mean that the cooperative aligns perfectly with the mission of the Cuffy 250 Committee, because they have been promoting self-activity and community building, which is essentially the same thing that cooperatives do. And Mr. Lucas, can you kind of tell us what are the benefits of cooperatives for Guyanese society at large, all of us collectively?
Well, I would say this. One of the most important activities of a co-op is education.
Yes.
It is recognized that participants in the cooperative movement must be able to understand, first of all, the role that they are expected to play in the movement because of its unique business form and organization. It doesn't follow the sole proprietorship or even the partnership. And I think Vincent pointed out also, it doesn't follow the corporate model, precisely, even though it has some similar elements. So education of what it is to be involved in a cooperative effort is very important. But equally important is understanding how to operate and manage a cooperative society. And I think to a large extent, we have suffered a significant decline in that regard because of the lack of support that the cooperative sector has received in recent years. In my view, had we had a stronger, infrastructural support for cooperatives, the education process, not only as individuals involved in cooperative activities, but general education, in my view, would have been far superior to what it is today. Now, the way in which the cooperative could provide, greater benefits to the national economy, it significantly depends upon the activities that people are involved in. And I think when we opened this program, you asked me the question of, why the cooperative was important to Guyana, and I pointed out to you that from a very practical point of view, we are still an agricultural economy.
Yes.
And agricultural production, it has been seen over the years, suffers from a couple of things. One is, natural disasters. Bad weather always affects agriculture in spite of the best technology that might exist. I mean, here we have a good example of the Skeldon. Even though it has all this modern technology, when the rains come, there's absolutely nothing that factory can do because there's nothing technologically sound that could deal with some of the conditions for harvesting and cultivating our game. So the significance, however, is that through the cooperative movement, many countries have found it possible to actually strengthen their agricultural production and to improve and increase their food security. And to show you the degree to which that is important to some of the major countries in this world, including the United States of America, I can tell you, for example, 94% of all dairy products in the United States of America are either produced by or marketed through co-op societies. If you were to take a country like Japan and even South Korea, 90% of their farmers are part of an agricultural cooperative society. Both South Korea and Japan, 90% are part of that. Norway is a country that we're quite familiar with because of the low carbon development program. The egg production, for example, poultry production, 99% of it is done through cooperatives in a country like Norway. So there are significant national economic benefits. In my view, it helps to stabilize food supply and guarantee it and increase the food security of a nation. And for that reason is why I would push strongly for us to examine the use of cooperatives in our agricultural development.
Definitely. And as was said earlier in the introductory statements, Mr. Lucas is a member of a cooperative. So Mr. Lucas, can you tell us a little about this cooperative? What exactly is it set up to do?
Okay, well, I'm part of the, in fact, I was re-elected chairman of the Technology Cooperative Society, which was set up, which was registered on the 2nd of October in 2009. So come October this year, we will be celebrating our 5th anniversary as a registered enterprise. Now, the Technology Co-op Society, notwithstanding the name, is a multi-purpose enterprise, which means that it could be involved in any legitimate business activity in Guyana. Our initial focus is to try and develop the educational skills of our members through technology education. Simple, basic, the study of simple computer application programs, the ones that we use every day, the Microsoft Word programs, the Excel programs, the database programs, as well as some of the more specialized applications that you may have for accounting or you may even have for engineering. We also felt that there was a need in Guyana to refocus the efforts of our children on science and technology. And we have been looking at ways in which we could develop interesting programs in the area of future technology, particularly dealing with the building of simple robots, looking at climate change, and trying to encourage people to think about law enforcement differently from how they do right now, by trying to persuade them to think also about learning about, forensic science and that sort of stuff. Simple study of DNA of various types of products, so that students could become a little more interested in aspects of law enforcement that might not appear obvious to them at this particular point in time. Beyond that, of course, we are also looking at helping members who might have a personal interest and perhaps capacity to engage in their own private business, an area that may not necessarily be of immediate interest to the co-op society, but as a member you may have that need. So what members are able to do is they are able to come to us, and we can do the feasibility studies for them, develop the business plans for them, and in the process we also try to help them to find any additional financing that they might need in order to get their work done. So in a nutshell, that is essentially what we are set up to do, but it therefore has given us an opportunity to be involved in a number of areas, and one of the areas in which we have most recently been involved in is that of agriculture. We were approached by farmers some farmers in Guyana, including Region 10, to help them to deal with some of the challenges that they face in the area of agriculture. And we have spent the last year working with them to develop their capacity and to help them to identify and find markets for their agricultural produce. So, we do that sort of thing as well. we worked with Victoria to organize its 2012 Indaba, which is the village meeting that it tries to have every year to address the concerns of the village and so forth. So we are engaged in a wide range of activities, but and we believe that, you know, with time we perhaps might be able to attract others to join the organization and help to expand the mission.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. And I think that it's excellent that this cooperative is multifaceted, so that it could have different influences in different areas of society. Mr. Alexander, have you ever been a part of any cooperative?
Yes, I have been. I was once involved in the cooperative that administers the Melanie Housing Project. As a young person, I had joined that cooperative. My aspiration then was to acquire my home through that cooperative. However, I left the country for studies and did not follow up on that. I am presently also engaged in the formation of a cooperative that will be involved in agricultural activities. So, yes, and probably I could use the opportunity just to be a bit more demonstrative on the question of how the cooperative works. Let's say, for example, 7 persons come together to form a cooperative.
Yes.
They may be given a lease of land by the state. So that land, that lease now becomes the lease of the cooperative. They may not be people who have a lot of financial resources. So in the old days, we had the agricultural bank, which they could approach. They can get a loan. So the cooperative gets the loan. So you're not seeing a lot of individual capital input because the state will have been encouraging the development of the cooperative. They then would work in the enterprise. If it's farming, they work together. And essentially what a cooperative does in the first instance is to provide them with an income based on their labor input. So the capital belongs to the cooperative as a collective. It's not identified necessarily with shares because of how the capital was accumulated, but they are beneficiaries by virtue of being workers in the cooperative and being paid for their labor input. Now, there are other instances where you may have individual farmers who have their individual sole trader operation, but they are not sufficiently endowed, for example, to buy a tractor or to buy whatever other piece of machinery they may require. They can then, those individual farmers, without giving up the individual ownership of their plots of land and things like that, can come together and cooperate in relation to the tractor purchase. So whilst one can't buy a tractor, they may be able to buy the tractor collectively.
Yes.
And then what they do, they share the tractor on a rotation basis. So that here it is, someone who may not access a tractor or may have to go and pay high fees
On their
to
own.
hire a tractor on their own,
Yes.
could access it through a cooperative effort. Now they're producing, and the produce has to be sold. We see in the country individual farmers come to town to sell their produce. Now they may decide that they again will be engaged in the selling collectively. So they can even have a roster of who goes to town when
Yes.
to sell. So they don't have to, each of them wouldn't have to expend all of his time each day
Yes.
farming, marketing, and selling. They can
Share responsibilities.
share those responsibilities.
Yes.
So there are various configurations that a cooperative could take to provide for access to resources, to provide for economies of scale, and to provide for employment. So it could become a very complex pyramid kind of operation.
Yes.
But what it does in the final analysis is to allow the ordinary man, who on his own may not be able to get involved in these ventures, to get involved through that collaborative, that cooperative endeavor. And I want to underline the point that Rawle made earlier. These advantages have been recognized worldwide.
Yes.
And in places where we tend to look and think they only have private enterprise. They have active cooperatives. In America, I think they have over 29,000
Wow.
cooperatives in a country called America that we don't normally associate with cooperatives. Canada is no different. In America, the cooperatives employ over 2 million employees. Over 2 million employees. And the annual revenue is somewhere in the vicinity of $652 billion. You know, nothing compared with the revenue of Guyana. $652 billion. So the cooperative movement has been a very powerful and vibrant movement across the world. And there are many instances, if I may make a last point, where families have been engaged in cooperatives. And there are lots of industries in America, agricultural industries, particularly in the wine production, that have grown over the years through the cooperative movement.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to add something to what Vincent said there. I mean, the global impact and dynamism of cooperatives. You know, one of the largest multinationals in this world is actually owned by a cooperative society. Yes, in France, you have the Credit Agricole Group, that's what it is called, and it's involved in finance and insurance and that sort of stuff. That company has subsidiaries in 60 countries around the world,
Wow.
but it is owned by a cooperative society. So much so, the way in which it is organized, as you said, as Vincent pointed out, there are different levels of organization. It results in 53% of the retail banking in France, where that group comes from, is done through co-op banks or cooperative societies. Let me say something else. The global international payment and money transfer system goes through a highway that is called an electronic highway that is known as, with the acronym SWIFT, or Society for Worldwide Interbank Telecommunication Transfers. You know, that's the name. All these ATM transactions and all the payments made around the world every day in international trade and so forth go through that system called SWIFT. Therefore, SWIFT is used by nearly all the financial institutions around the world. Trillions of dollars every day go through that system. And that organization, SWIFT, is a cooperative society registered in Belgium. That is to give you the extent to which cooperatives underpin global activity and is important internationally.
Well,
Let me even add this piece. I know.
Go
You know,
ahead.
in Europe, for example, what they have now done, they have even carried this thing a little further. You could be living in France, but you could be a member of a cooperative in Belgium or the Netherlands. That's how far cooperatives have emerged
yes.
as, you know, important economic units that are supporting, you know, domestic and global international transactions.
Well, to be honest, I have never been anywhere near to a cooperative, but only because I didn't exactly understand how cooperatives work or what are the individual benefits of a cooperative. And I'm sure a lot of our viewers have had the same issue with not knowing. Well, now that you know, the opportunity is there for you to become a part of a cooperative. And to our viewers, if you are just joining us, I am Elsie Harry, and this is African Drums, a feature of the Cuffy 250 Committee. And today we have been discussing the benefits, significance, and history of cooperatives on a global level and in the Afro-Guyanese communities. And our in-studio guests are Mr. Vincent Alexander and Mr. Rawle Lucas. And the final question that I have for our guests are about the rights of cooperatives. Where do the rights of cooperatives begin and the authority of government ends? Where is that sort of demarcation?
Well, what we need to recognize is that a cooperative would be seen as a legal person. You know, in the nature of things, societies have essentially two kinds of legal persons.
Yes.
You have the natural legal person. We are all born legal persons with rights and obligations. And you have the artificial legal person, and those are organizations which are created to conduct business in their own right with members and things like that. And cooperatives fall within that category. So they are legal persons. They can enter into business transactions. They can sue. They can be sued. They're responsible for the acts that they carry out. Most legal persons, all legal persons, there is some level of regulation that takes place to ensure that the way they relate to others is fair and just. And in the case of businesses, the way in which they relate internally to their members, and in the instance of cooperatives, to the members of the cooperatives, that they are also fair and just. There is some kind of regulation that the state becomes involved in. So that really, first of all, in a cooperative, it has the right to be registered. In other words, to attain that status.
Yes.
So there's a mechanism by which they can be registered. Once they become registered, then they have obligations that flow to their membership, and you have a state body. In this instance, it's the ministry and the chief cooperative development officer to ensure that they do certain things. Ensure, for example, that they have their annual meeting, ensure that they have their annual audit of accounts, so as to ensure that there's a good level of governance
Yes.
In the body, in the interest of the membership. So really, cooperatives are allowed to conduct their own business.
Yes.
There is no day-to-day interference in their business. As I said in the principles, they're autonomous and
Yes.
independent. But in the conduct of their own business, the state requires them to do certain things in the interest of the cooperative itself and its membership. And those things have to do with accountability and participation and things like that. In the instance where they're in breach of those things, then the state, under the law, has an obligation to step in
Yes.
to regularize and to ensure that there is fairness and equity in terms of the decisions they make and the acts they carry out in relation to their members and in relation to other similar organizations.
Okay. Mr. Lucas, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, the only thing we have to keep in mind is that the cooperative would be one of the several types of groups that you can have in a society. And the state, of course, being one of them, has, the preeminence of authority over all the other groups. So to the extent that anything that the cooperative society does that is not consistent with the wider laws of the society, then the state can step in, to protect the interests of both the cooperative society as well as any other party who might be at risk of injury as a result of what might be taking place. So in general, I think, we recognize that the cooperative society operates within the ambit of the national laws.
Okay, thank you for that. And this has been a really interesting discussion, but unfortunately, this is all the time that we have. So thank you, Mr. Alexander and Mr. Lucas, for speaking to us about the history of cooperatives, their benefit for the individual as well as the collective. And thank you, viewers, for staying with us. This has been African Drums, a feature of the Cuffy 250 Committee. I am Elsie Harry, and I want to remind you to check out our Facebook page. It is Cuffy 250. You can also check out our YouTube channel, Cuffy 250 again, and feel free to send us an email, cuffy250gy@gmail.com, if you'd like to donate, get involved, or be a part of the discussion. Thank you for watching. Please tune in next time. Goodbye.